Hi, and welcome back to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jean Farish, and I am so glad that you're here with me today. We're going to talk about a variety of things. I'm going to do a quick tutorial on both the stem stitch and the back stitch. We're going to talk about some framing issues, specifically when it's important to put glass on needlework, and kind of the I don't know, the pros and cons of using glass. So I'm going to start with, this is Down Home ABCs, and it is a design that I did back in the 80s, and I love to tell the story about how this piece came about. There was a wonderful needlework exhibit and kind of a, not really a retreat as much, well, it was classes, and there was a needlework competition, and it was in a unique park, or I don't know, kind of an attraction called Rock Home Gardens. I mean, maybe some of you went to it back in the 80s, and I loved going. I loved taking my kids because they could just have the day free to just enjoy being outdoors, and they made friends with other kids that were there, and that was great. But the drive from New Jersey to Rock Home Gardens was a long one, and of course, being a single mom, I did, all the driving, so I needed to keep the kids entertained. Now, this, of course, is way before personal iPads and having videotapes in the car and all the things that we entertain kids with today. So we relied on some of the same car games or road trip games that I learned to play as a kid. And one of them was naming things, different objects with each, that started with each letter of the alphabet. And there would usually be a theme, like I'm going to a picnic and I'm going to bring an apple. And the next person would say, I'm going to a picnic and I'm going to bring an apple and a basket. And it would just go on and on all the way from A to Z. Great way to entertain kids when you don't have electronics. So after we played that a couple of times, I thought, you know what, let's pick a theme. Like, what would you find in like kind of a down-home country, a country store or a farm, or, that kind of an atmosphere. And the kids, they jumped right on it, and we started naming things. And after a few minutes, I thought, you know what, we should be writing these down. And so by that time, both the girls were old enough to be good automobile secretaries when we were on the road, and so they started writing these things down. And when I got to the motel where we were staying, I started designing this piece, and that's how this came about, was just entertaining the kids on a road trip to Rock Home Gardens. So why does it need to be framed now? Let's take a look at this. Okay, so because this was framed without glass, but framed with a mat, can you see how the mat has warped over time? And that's a problem. So when you are contemplating framing something that you are going to be using mats with, glass is, I hate to say a prerequisite, but it pretty much, you should use glass when you're going to be using a mat. Now, why didn't I on this piece? Again, I've explained this before, that especially in the early days of my career as a designer, my pieces traveled a lot. They were sent from shop to shop on trunk shows. And of course, I did a lot of teaching and traveling, like my trip to Rock Home Gardens, where I took my samples with me. And so I did not want to travel with the pieces under glass, because if the glass broke, it could cause a lot of damage. So the idea was that after the piece stopped being a traveling piece, then I would reframe it with glass. Well, here we are umpteen years later, and I still haven't gotten around to this. I think this piece was probably like from 1986 maybe. So it's been around for a while. There are more questions and issues related to glass, and one of them is the different types of glass to use, which I'm not going to get into right now because that's just too lengthy. So let's talk just specifically about the question, when to use glass, when not to use glass. And I know that this is, for many people, a big controversy. And I'm just going to tell you what my take on this is, based on my experience and talking to various people. And then when I'm all done, you get to take that information and do what pleases you. Okay, so there are certainly lots of people who always use glass, and I'm beginning to be one of them. If you live in a house where there are people who smoke, that's a reason to use glass. If you live in an environment that where there's a lot of, let's say, pollen at various times of the year, and you are someone who has your windows open a lot, that's a reason to use glass. So part of it is, what is the environment that the piece is going to be in? Now, the biggest complaint I hear from people about why not to use glass is they feel like the detail is lost. And I don't know. I guess I'd have to look at the same piece, maybe take a piece and have glass over half of it and no glass on the other half, and determine how much detail is lost. When I look at the cost-benefit ratio, when I look at what are the disadvantages of not having glass and the advantages of having glass, then to me the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages. Let's see, I'm leaving some things out. A lot of it too depends on, say, the moisture content of the air where you live. If you are, for example, if you live near the seashore or any place where there's often a lot of high humidity, that's another reason to use glass. So again, these are all reasons that have to do with the environment where the piece is going to live. And then there's the question of, like, if you're going to use mats, you almost have to use glass because the mats are going to buckle after a certain amount of time. And maybe it's because I'm getting up in years myself, but from 1986 to now, it does not seem that long to me. It's not like we're talking 100 years. So I would say that is also a reason to use glass. Now, with that said, you want to keep your glass off the piece of needlework. You don't want it to be right smack up against the needlework. And there are two very easy ways to keep that from happening. The first obvious one is when you use a mat, because then the mat is going to lift that glass up off the piece of needlework. But when you don't use a mat, framers use something that's simply called a spacer that they put between, it's hidden. It's not something you see at all. It's under the lip of the mat, under the lip of the frame is where it rests between the needlework and the glass. So you're kind of building a sandwich. You've got your needlework, you've got the little spacer, and then you've got the glass on top of that. So, anyway, so that's kind of where I am with this particular piece. When I completely take it apart, I don't know what I'm going to find. I will definitely be sharing that with you. I have a feeling that this piece is going to show that it needs to be washed and remounted. I'm completely on board with that and prepared to spend that time and energy doing it again and getting it right for posterity. Again, the piece not only means a lot to me as a stitcher because I really enjoyed doing it, but that story that I told you about how the project even came about means a lot to me and my girls. So that's another reason to keep it in really good shape for many, many years. I started thinking about this piece because I got some questions about backstitching, and Sue really summed it up really well with a nice compliment to me. I'll just be upfront about that. It was certainly nice to hear. She said, I have a question about your straight stitch lettering. When I do lettering, it looks like my stitches are pushed aside with the next thread that comes from the hole, and the threads aren't laying straight. So backstitch lettering can be tricky, and if you don't execute them in a certain way, then they will look wonky. Now, some of that wonkiness is the nature of backstitch lettering, and there's nothing you can do about it. But there are some tips I can give you that will keep the wonkiness at bay. Now, the best way for me to teach you how to do pretty back stitches is to first teach you how to do a stem stitch. So let me get my needle threaded, and if you want to grab a needle and a sample piece of fabric and stitch along with me, that would be great. I'm going to demonstrate the stem stitch on linen, although you can do this on Aida without a problem. Remember that on linen, I'm stitching something that's 2 threads wide and 2 threads high is the same as a square on Aida. So right now, my first stitch, I'm actually going to come ahead 4 linen threads. So on Aida, that would be 2 squares. And I'm scooping up just 2 threads on my needle, doing this as a sewing motion. Now, I'm going to put my thread up here for just a moment to point out to you that my stitch, as you can see, is actually 4 threads wide. Now, the important thing with a stem stitch is that as I'm stitching, my working thread, this thread, needs to stay below my needle. So each time, I'm going to scoop up the next 2 linen threads, bring my working thread down, scoop up the next 2 linen threads, keep my working thread down, and just keep going ahead. Now again, if you're working on Aida, each time on my needle I'm picking up 2 linen threads, you'd be picking up 1 Aida square. Now I can hear the questions already, and one of them would be, can you do this without doing it as a sewing motion? And I will say that you can, but what's hard about it is, let me demonstrate it as a poke and pull. If I'm not going to sew, before I pull this thread down, my working thread, before I pull it taut, I need to hold it down out of the way so that I can make sure that I'm seeing where I need to stitch. So if I pull it taut, as I just did, I need to then get it out of the way. So again, if I pull it taut, I need to scoop it out of the way to be able to see where my needle goes. Now, when you look at the stem stitch carefully, you can see where it looks like a twisted rope. Let me see if I can adjust the light here a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. And that makes a really, really pretty stem stitch. Now, the reason I'm showing you this stitch first is that on the back, you'll have the prettiest back stitch you've ever done. So the trick to pretty back stitch is very similar to what makes a pretty stem stitch, and that is where your working thread lies. You'll have a smoother lettering by always keeping your working thread either below your needle or above your needle. So now this is the exact same piece I was just doing. So now let's continue this row as a back stitch. Now remember that when you're doing a back stitch, you're going backwards. So my stitch is going from here to here. My line direction, I'm building this line going from here to here, but my stitch is going from here to here, which is why we call it a back stitch. Oops. So I'm coming ahead 2 threads, but you can see my needle is actually making a stitch that's 4 threads wide. So that's all a back stitch is. Now it's one thing to do a back stitch in a straight line. It's quite another to do it as lettering. So let's see what that looks like when you start making shapes with your back stitch. And that is where I'll be frank with you, I can't always do it as a sewing motion. When I can, I will. But let's say, for example, if I'm going to come ahead 2 threads and down 2 threads to make a slant. Let's make this into a letter O. So when I can, since I'm coming up the straight side of the O, that is when I am going to sew. That's fine. You can go back and forth between the 2 methods. And if you're working on a frame or in an embroidery hoop or whatever, and you can't do this as a sewing motion, that's okay too. You just have to do it poking and pulling. So I hope that helps a little bit in terms of understanding, for one thing, the difference between back stitch and stem stitch, and realizing that when you're doing a straight line, they're each the reverse of each other. And that if you are mindful of where your working thread is, I think that that's one of the things that will give you a smoother transition between the individual stitches that make up a back stitch. So that's how I do it, and I hope that that will help you with your stitching as well. Another secret to successful back stitching of lettering, when you have a lot of lettering to do, is to use flower thread if you can get a hold of it. Now, flower thread is heavier than embroidery floss. Generally speaking, 2 strands of embroidery floss is about the same weight as a single strand of flower thread. Now, I think that flower thread may have been a little easier to get a hold of in the 80s than it is now. For one thing, DMC no longer makes it, or I don't know whether or not they still manufacture it. They make a lot of threads that are not sold widely in the US, so don't quote me on that. Ginny Thompson flower thread is another great brand that's been around for many, many years. And if you can get a hold of it, there's also Danish flower thread, which is nice. Let's see. Okay, so this is the Ginny Thompson flower thread. It already comes on cardboard bobbins, which is a nice feature. And then the DMC flower thread, when you can get it, is in skeins. I still have quite a supply of it, which I'm gradually selling. And then the Danish flower thread also comes in a skein that's labeled. Now, besides the fact that it's a little harder, I think, to come by, it also is a little more limited in the color range that you're going to come across. But again, if you're doing a long verse in backstitch and you don't have to match a particular thread, if it just needs to coordinate with the other colors, then flower thread can be a good option. Like in that Down Home ABCs, it's simply black, and so obviously that's, you know, kind of a standard color to get a hold of. So and the other thing to know about flower thread is that it doesn't have the sheen that floss has. It is more of a matte finish, M-A-T-T-E finish. And they're the biggest differences. So if you can get a hold of it, that's a great option for doing long verses in backstitch. Okay, I'm going to move on to questions that have come in from people who have been watching the FlossTube videos. And the first one comes from Raquel, and she asked, does it matter from which end of the floss you stitch? I've seen people say you must thread your needles from the farthest end. And this is this is a question that needleworkers have been asking as long as I have been stitching. Does floss have a nap? Does it matter from which end of the skein you pull your thread? Well, okay, yes, it matters which end you pull your thread from in terms of being able to pull it smoothly. There is a right or wrong way in that regard, so that the floss doesn't tangle as you're pulling it out. But the question is, I think, is there a right or wrong end for which end you thread into your needle? Now, again, I think that you've already learned this about me. I don't shy away from controversy. And this has been a hot issue for many needleworkers. There's one camp that says, yes, it absolutely matters, and your stitches will never lie the same, and they will not be as pretty if you don't stitch from the correct end of the thread. And there are others who say it doesn't matter. And I belong in that camp, the one that says it doesn't matter. I don't really know how to kind of get into this. I had the wonderful privilege of going to tour the DMC factory in France. And I asked that question of the technicians that we met. And they basically told me, no, it doesn't have a direction. It doesn't have a nap. If you believe strongly that it does, and you have worked out a system for always knowing which is the correct end to be threading in the eye of your needle, then more power to you. I'm not telling you you're wrong. I'm not telling you to stop doing that. But I am going to tell you that if you don't see a difference, then don't fret about it. And here's part of my logic of this. What I'm thinking is, okay, if I'm going to be a purist about it, and I'm always going to be stitching from the correct end, so I pull my length of floss out of my skein. So now I've got my 6 strands, and I'm going to pull 2 out and lay them down carefully so I know which end is the correct end. And now I have 4 strands left, and what am I going to do with them? So that when I pick them up again, an hour from now, 15 minutes from now, a week from now, a month from now, I will know what is the correct end. Do I put a knot in the wrong end? I mean, it just becomes kind of a storage issue to me And that starts making my head want to explode. It's like, why worry about it? Again, if you visually see a difference in your stitching because you're always stitching from the same end of the skein, then fine. But if you're not, then, welcome to my world, because I'm just not going to make myself crazy about it. So that's really, from my own experience and from talking to the technician at DMC and assuming he was giving me an honest answer, that there is not a nap to floss, then I'm fine with the way I'm stitching. I like the way my stitches look, and I'm just going to carry on. Okay, so question from Kimberly. Do you cut the foam core a slight bit smaller than the dimension of the edges of your basting stitch, so the basting stitches do not show on the front of your piece? Now, this under the category of framing question. So when first of all, I estimate what size to cut the foam core, and I have the foam core cut, and then I do my basting in general. Sometimes I do it the other way around, but I don't necessarily cut the foam core smaller for that reason. But if I'm using a ready-made frame or a frame that I already have and I want to reuse, then yes, you need to cut your foam core slightly smaller than the frame opening, because the fabric itself, even though fabric's pretty thin, does take up some space, and it would be better for it to be slightly too small than slightly too big. Remember, your frame has a lip to it. It's an L shape, and your foam core is going to fit inside that lip. So even if you leave your basting threads in once you've done the pinning, they're not going to show. It's going to be hidden under the lip of the frame. And that's a new practice for me. Previously, I always took my basting threads out. Now I'm beginning to leave them in place because they're not going to show. And I feel like that every once in a while when I pull them out, I can end up sort of dislodging the threads a little bit. And, again, better not to mess with it if I don't need to. So I hope, Kimberly, that answers your question. While we're on the subject of foam core, I want to point out to you that there are a lot of different types of foam core. In fact, when I was doing a little bit of research, I went to the Blick, BLICK.com website. It's a great website for people who want to buy artists' supplies. And they had types of foam core that I didn't even know existed. So the foam core you're going to find at a big box store or like a Dollar Tree or whatever that you might grab to do a kid's school project, that's not the foam core you want to use for your most treasured needlework, because I can almost guarantee you it's not going to be acid free, not unless they bought a big lot of it and, or just selling it cheap. So do make sure that it is acid-free foam core, because basically what that means is that the paper that's wrapping the foam core is acid-free. So that's an important distinction to make. One of the topics that comes up in a lot of questions is the topic of needles. And of course, it's one of our most basic tools. And I can see where there's a lot of things that we need to know about them and things that we need to concern ourselves with. So some of the questions I've gotten have to do with storing needles and where I keep them when I'm not using them, where I keep them on my project. And this is a good time to point out that one of the drawbacks to stitching in hand, and actually I think it's probably the only one that kind of I really think about, is that stitching in hand, the fabric doesn't support the weight of many of the needle minders that are out there. And needle minders are so much fun. They're cute, they're pretty, they're funny. They help celebrate occasions and events and holidays. And a lot of people like to kind of match their needle minder to the theme of what they're stitching. I like making them out of things I find on souvenirs, whether they're buttons or anything small that I can just glue a magnet to. I do that pretty often, as well as buy them. So let me show you the needle minder I end up using because I'm stitching in hand, and it's just practical. There's nothing cute or funny or thematic or whatever about it. It's just 2 square magnets, and it holds my needle, and it's not, the weight doesn't pull down on my fabric too much. So this is the one that this is just it's just a real workhorse. When it comes to needle threaders, the type that I really like is this type, and it has 2 different size hooks on it, a smaller one, and then on the other end a larger one, and then there's a hole on them. Is where I attach what you might think of as a scissor fob, just to make it easier to find. And these types of scissor fobs are also great for if when we're once again able to be in classes and retreats and whatnot, and you're with a lot of other stitchers, it's just a nice way of identifying your things, and it's very easy for all the needle threaders to look alike, and several pairs of scissors to look alike, and just kind of a nice way of identifying it. And it's also a little bit of self-expression, so make it a little bit of fun that way. This type of needle threader I like so much better than the type that we traditionally think of as a needle threader that you often find in sewing supply stores. That's like a wire, and frankly they are just not strong enough to withstand the weight of the threads that we stitch with, which are so much thicker than a sewing thread, and sometimes you have to tug a little bit, and those wire type needle threaders can just snap so easily. So that's the kind I like, and hopefully you can find one in your favorite needlework store, whether you're shopping in person or still shopping by phone and doing curbside pickup or whatever. Just ask them if they have that type. There's a lot of different brands. Loran is a nice one, but I'm sure your favorite needlework store has them on hand. Let's see. That's actually, again, it always surprises me when I get down to the end of my list. So when you are shopping in person or by phone or whatever, do ask for my charts, and I hope that you find a resource for them in a local store. If not, please shop my Etsy store, because I would love to help you out there too. Remember, my Etsy store, it's only PDFs. I don't sell the printed charts. Those you have to get from a shop. So I hope that you'll tune in next week. Take a moment and subscribe before you leave the channel today. And between now and next Saturday, I hope that you will stitch happy and be safe.